everyone, this is Barry, Herman High School Civil Rights Team Advisor, here wearing my Civil Rights Team cord in support of the senior members that are continuing to uphold the Civil Rights Team Project's mission this year throughout the school closure. So today I'm here to talk to you about a really important court case that happened this week in history. The case is Brown versus the Board of Education. The decision served to greatly motivate the civil rights team movement in the early 1950s through the 1960s and ultimately led to the abolishment of racial segregation in all public facilities, including public education. So to fully understand this case, it's really important to have some context. And the big question here was, did Brown versus Board of Education and school segregation go against our 14th Amendment rights? In an earlier case, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court upheld that separate but equal was constitutional. In 1953, the court was split. There were many questions as to our constitutional rights and also the rights of each state. So equality versus federalism. They really wanted to table it and hear more briefings and opinions. And one thing that really helped establish an concise opinion was the use of the controversial doll experiment. When looking at the big picture of separate schools, prejudice, discrimination, and segregation created a feeling of inferiority among African American children and damaged their self-esteem. Here with us today is the Doctor of Psychology to explain the doll experiments.
In the 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark designed a series of experiments often referred to as the doll tests. The doll tests were created to study the psychological effects of segregation on African American children. The experiments conducted used 4 identical dolls, identical except for their color. The children in the experiments were between the ages of 3 and 7, and they were asked to identify the race of each doll and which doll that they preferred to play with. The majority of children chose the white doll, often giving the white doll positive characteristics of personality and behavior. And the doll test concluded that prejudice, discrimination, and segregation created a feeling of inferiority among African American children, critically hurting the development of their self-esteem and sense of self-worth. The doll tests were a critical piece of evidence used in the Brown versus Board Supreme Court case. Since I have a 6-year-old, I decided to do my own doll test. Let's go see. Here we have Sailor and some of her baby dolls. Sailor.
What?
Which doll is your favorite doll? Can you show me your favorite doll? Oh, very pretty. Why is she your favorite doll?
Because she has a purple outfit and the way her hands look.
What do her hands look like? Are they strong hands?
No.
No?
They're baby hands.
They're baby hands?
Because look at her eyes.
Oh. What about her eyes?
Her eyes look like she's first born.
Oh. Probably doesn't like having your finger in them. Yeah?
That one has green eyes, but that's the littlest. Those are bigger.
Oh.
And this is the biggest.
Cool. Thank you, Sailor.
As I mentioned, in 1953, the justices were divided and decided to put the case on hold. Then enters Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was appointed and believed at his core that segregation was unconstitutional. He also believed that it was very important to have a unanimous decision in order to gain legitimacy and support from the South. Warren encouraged judges not to look at equality of these particular schools, but rather the impact segregation has on society as a whole. Please listen to Chief Justice Earl Warren.
The Honorable, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court. Good morning. I have always believed that segregation is unconstitutional, but the pain and division in this nation requires a unanimous court. There can't be any question in the struggle between equality and states' rights. We are all Americans, regardless of where a person lives, and we should all enjoy the blessings of liberty and equality. As Thurgood Marshall argued, maintaining segregated schools denies children the ability to get the same thing at the same time and in the same place. It has taken me several drafts, but the opinion finally achieved unanimous support from all the justices on the United States Supreme Court. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This decision ends federal tolerance of racial segregation in America's schools.
How did society view this during a time before instant media coverage and the internet? Newspapers and word of mouth were a lifeline and were responsible for informing our citizens. Here with us today is one of the top media analysts in history.
Hello. Newspapers all around the country have reacted to the Supreme Court's recent ruling. As a media analyst, it's my job to compare how different media outlets are covering this story. Let's start in Kansas, where the story originated. The Topeka State Journal showed a favorable reaction to the ruling, with the Topeka Board of Education on the record saying, quote, "The acceptance of this policy by the people of Topeka is a fine example for the rest of the country, which I am sure will honor this decision of the Supreme Court with temperate action and genuine compliance." However, in Mississippi, the coverage on this story has not been as favorable. On May 18th, the cover of the Jackson Daily News read, quote, "Segregation in schools of Jackson and state to continue despite court." The front page includes the photographs of 7 school officials who weighed in on their disgust in the decision. All are white males. Meanwhile, in the North, the states are in support of the decision. The front page of the Providence Journal displayed a large, joyful photograph of the anti-segregationist legal team consisting of African Americans George Hayes, Thurgood Marshall, and James Nabrett Jr. The story claims the decision to be, quote, "a sound one, which advances the interests of social justice in the United States." Despite the more favorable coverage in the northern states, the truth of the matter remains that regardless of your geography and your politics, the press continuously minimizes what is happening to our Black communities and the lack of change that they are seeing in their daily lives.
The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally gave some teeth to Brown. The act, supported by the executive branch, empowered the federal government to cut funding to schools that continued to segregate their students and gave the U.S. Department of Justice authority to file lawsuits seeking desegregation of schools. But not all African Americans celebrated. Some worried that desegregation would further alienate Black people in white society, that it would lead to the elimination of jobs for Black school teachers, that it would do little to eliminate the racism in people's hearts and minds. Here with us today is a teacher to talk about the impact this made on education and educators.
The landmark court case of Brown versus Board of Education, from a teacher's perspective, brings some new light to things. So for one, of course, schools were now integrated, and they would begin the integration process. This was something that had been long fought for and was finally able to be achieved through the passing of this court case. But there were some unintended consequences as well. It caused the dismissal, the demotion, and forced resignation of many experienced and highly credentialed Black educators who staffed the only Black schools. After the decision, tens of thousands of Black teachers and principals lost their jobs as white superintendents began to integrate schools, but balked at putting Black educators in position of authority over white teachers or over white students. In parts of the Deep South, Georgia and South Carolina, teachers who supported the NAACP were threatened with the loss of their jobs, and anyone who dared to teach both races in the same classroom risked their careers. Even to this day, we're still feeling the effects, as there is a smaller percentage of educators that are of the African American population.
Hello and welcome to week 5 of History Makers Madness. We are down to the final 4. We saw an even bigger increase in participation this week, so thank you for listening to me. We love everybody that's involved and engaging. So let's start this off with Mr. Peterson.
So the matchup that I got my eye on here is the Abelardo da Vinci one between Leonardo da Vinci and Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to go with Leonardo da Vinci here because if you look closely into it, you'd see that on April 15th, 1452, Leonardo da Vinci was born. And then 213 years later, on the same day, April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died in a building near Ford's Theater called the Peterson House. What do you think about that, Uncle Chocolate?
Well, I mean, okay, yes, Lincoln may have died. There may have been some sort of coincidence going on with the same date and everything like this, but both of these historical figures are dead. And who has more recognition for our voters in this matchup? Abraham Lincoln. He has, the monument in Washington, D.C., and he's on the $5 bill. I think Lincoln, he's got the iconic beard. He is going to carry the day. This is not even going to be a contest. Lincoln's going to the finals. Mr. Hargrove?
Well, this week I'm looking at the Martin Luther King Jr. versus Albert Einstein matchup, and I'm going to go with the mad scientist Albert Einstein. I mean, when you look at Albert Einstein, he looks like the mad scientist, and probably that's because he's got a mad mustache. He has the whole E equals MC squared thing. He escaped Germany before the Nazis came in. He helped the United States develop some mutually assured destruction capability. So I'm going to go with Albert Einstein this week. And I'd like to welcome to the team Mrs. Ireland. What do you got this week?
I am standing with Martin Luther King Jr. because as I can recognize that Einstein had a huge impact on the history of the world, being involved with the atomic bomb and ending World War II and all of that. I'll give him that. I'll give him that credit. But Martin Luther King was for civil rights, and that is rights with all people. And he also had a great mustache. He didn't have the flashy big hair to distract from the mustache. He had the nice clean cut hair, drawing attention to the mustache. Great guy, loved to give speeches, loved to get the crowd going. And not to mention, we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We don't have Albert Einstein Day. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, thank you, Miss Ireland, for adding that. I also want to point out, as the Civil Rights Team Advisor, I'm with you on this one, and I think it's a really great choice for this week's episode as well. And thank you for joining us today. I'm eager to see where we get with this, so make sure that you are voting and checking out
the work that we're doing for this. We've really enjoyed it, and we love to see you guys' input. So thank you.
Nice sweatshirt.